Morning from Bethesda, Maryland, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. It's great to be back. Day 4 of the plenary session. Today's session focuses on auditor reporting and our post-implementation review. Ultimately, you'll be asked about the recommendation from the auditor report and implementation working group, including matters for consideration for our current work streams, and also to help guide future actions in accordance with our framework for activities. One of the things that was mentioned yesterday as part of our work plan review is, how does this effort impact our future work plan? And I think that is right. And it sort of works the other way too, is one thing I concluded from yesterday is we have a number of really urgent issues to take on and be prepared for. Any commitment we make today has an impact on all the other matters that we want to take on. And, I issued a cautionary note the other day about guidance and support materials. We really should be conscious that we have all these other priorities to deal with as well as we take it up. Now, I think the package itself is pretty sensible and is a good basis for discussion. So I'm not saying anything about the working group's recommendations, but it's a caution to us as we take on more commitments. We're already 100% committed from a resource perspective. So when things become free, there's competing interests here. And so if we rush to do something else on auditor reporting, it probably means that it's taking scarce resource away. It's not to say that we shouldn't do it. The other thing to think about as we go through this exercise is, are there other parties that could possibly assist if we think action is necessary as well, such as national standard setters? So those are my thoughts leading into it. I look forward to a good discussion. I want to thank the working group for their excellent research. The hope is today that this will conclude our post-implementation review, and we could start going on to whatever action we agree. So with that, I turn it over to Dan, who chaired the working group for us. So thank you, Dan, and all the members of the working group and staff for all your excellent work, and look forward for the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Tom, and hello, everyone. Very pleased to be able to be here with you today to present the recommendations of the working group on the post-implementation review as we bring closure to that process, as Tom mentioned. It's been a long journey for many of you that were involved with the auditor reporting project with ISO 720 or with implementation activities or other activities within your firm's organizations or in your jurisdictions. And for me, it's the end of about a dozen years or so working on the auditor reporting project. So I'm pleased to be able to have been a part of this working group to bring us to this point. Looking forward to the board's views on the recommendations today and any matters that may need to be further considered as the IAASB then pursues any possible actions. One last time, I'd just like to thank and acknowledge the working group, Chun-Wee, Sachiko, Jamie, and Sylvia. Thank you for all of your input and support and efforts, as well as staff, Kalina and Armand, thank you. And also thanks to Vili for his helpful input and guidance along the way. Obviously, the goal for today is to get the board's input on the recommendations of the working group. We will be essentially using agenda item 5. As you noted from the paper, the recommendations were based on the key themes that were discussed with the board back in February, and further details have been provided in various sections of the paper about those themes and the recommendations, and of course also linked the recommendations to the board's framework for activities. There were 3 supplements that were provided for your reference. They won't be discussed today, but I may refer to them as we go through. As noted, in the paper, we're going to present the recommendations in groups and then pause for board discussion after each of the groups. So there'll be 4 rounds of discussion and a final round on closing off the PIR. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is a bit of a refresher on the discussion from February. The key findings were summarized in the feedback statement that was issued in June of 2021. And of course, there was overwhelming support across stakeholder groups for the enhancements made. Many pointed to key audit matters, of course, and the structure of the report, the opinion first, et cetera. Some implementation and practical challenges were noted. And what we heard from stakeholders was more time and information is needed to consider whether additional information might be needed in the report, auditor's report, to improve transparency or to extend the conditional requirements there today for that apply only to listed entities. And of course, there continues to be support across the board for informative auditor reporting and continued engagement. The next slide, please. The working group's process for these recommendations should be straightforward, easy to understand. It's described in the paper. Of course, considered the feedback from all of the information gathering activities, the survey and other sources. Did consider how any proposed actions relate to the IAASB's framework for activities, as I mentioned. And that's all couched in terms of any decisions about the current and the future work plans of the board. And then, as mentioned in February, there were some very important cautions from stakeholders that are noted here on the slide, just to make sure that enough time was given for experiences to arrive at the right conclusions, to consider targeted improvements, not lengthy projects, and of course to give due consideration to stakeholders' ability to absorb any changes arising from this effort with everything else that is going on at the moment. So the next slide, please. I'm not going to discuss this slide. It's in the paper, and simply this was a way the task force thought would be helpful to link the recommendations to the key themes that were identified, but also to try to link this to the framework for activities. So as you can see from this particular slide in the graphic, any possible standard setting considerations really relate to the activities of other IAASB work streams. And there is a mention of targeted revisions, which was clearly preferred by stakeholders, as I mentioned, as opposed to lengthy projects. So with that, let's turn to the recommendations. As noted in the paper, some of the recommendations were specific to the key themes that had been identified from the information gathering. Others were more general and cut across the themes. And you also probably picked up the interrelationship of some of these recommendations. So we'll look first at recommendations 1, 2, and 5. With respect to key audit matters, there was much support, obviously, for CAM, but some concerns were noted. On the support side, the investors and others in particular noted that the communication of CAM had increased the transparency, put the focus on matters that were, of course, most important to the auditor. But on the concern side, keeping CAM fresh year over year, making them entity specific, avoiding boilerplate language, et cetera. Also some comments about including outcomes or observations from the auditor in the communication of CAM. Those same views were expressed when the auditor reporting standards were issued. And there were mixed views then. There continues to be mixed views. Some find those outcomes helpful, and others were concerned about the perception of piecemeal opinion. There was one other matter that was raised, and that's shown on the slide here, and that's extending the communication of key audit matters beyond listed entities and to public interest entities. Actually, there was broad support across stakeholders for doing this, but there also were comments that because of the different definitions of PI, that this perhaps should be a jurisdictional decision. And the auditor reporting working group thinks that the PI working group is in the best position to further explore this matter in looking at the proposed case-by-case approach to the differential requirements in the standards. So if we could go to the next slide. Going concern and the underlying comments and analysis was presented in section 5 of the paper. But clearly this was a topic of great interest to stakeholders, particularly in the current environment. The board already has got the going concern initiative in process. And the takeaway from this is that there was consistency in what we heard during the auditor reporting implementation information gathering with what the going concern working group has heard through its consultations and discussions to this point. So the recommendation here is to coordinate with the going concern working group in those areas where further clarity may be needed. And there were a couple of areas that were pointed to by respondents or by stakeholders, and that's the lack of clarity perhaps in the standards with respect to the differences in reporting between CAM, material uncertainty related to going concern, and EOM and OM paragraphs that perhaps could be clarified. As well as some further calls for communication about going concern in what is referred to as close call situations, something I believe the board has discussed with, as a part of the going concern initiative. So that is part of working with the going concern work stream, coordinating with them to explore as they explore what might be best in this area, and with input from the auditor reporting working group. If we can go to the next slide. This is broadly relating to other matters that could be communicated to enhance transparency. And again, we point to the going concern, the fraud, and the PI work streams, all of which are exploring increased transparency in one form or another in the auditor's report. Specifically, there was mention by stakeholders of the additional communication about materiality and scope of the audit, which is being done in some jurisdictions. There continues to be mixed views in this regard, particularly with respect to materiality and outcomes with respect to CAM, as I mentioned. So the upshot of all of this was that the working group determined that continued engagement with others was needed to explore the global demand for this type of information, and also to consider what might be done to enhance consistency in auditor reporting. Just keeping a look at what's being done in other jurisdictions and taking that into account for any future considerations. So with that, please go to the next slide. And Tom, that would get us to the point of getting board input on the first group of recommendations here, 1, 2, and 5 on CAM, going concern, and then the broader notion of transparency.
Dan, I asked this for you because non-authoritative support material could mean a lot of things, but when I asked the question, you said what was meant by it, you meant the updating of FAQs largely on recommendation 1?
Yeah, that's correct, Tom, and I think that was noted in the paper that when the working group was referring to non-authoritative guidance, by and large, the group determined that updating the existing auditor reporting frequently asked questions was the best way to do that. We'll already have a document out there and some targeted matters that had been identified that could be usefully addressed by updating those FAQs.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we'll take comments on recommendation 1, 2, and 5. Josephine.
Good morning, or actually good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Dan and staff and the rest of the task force for all this hard work, really appreciate it. And also for an excellent paper, very easy to read, very easy to walk through. So not surprising with Dan in the lead there. On recommendation 1, second point, exploring communication CAM for PIEs. I'm absolutely supportive of that. We already have this in the UK and have done for some time now. So it hasn't really, as far as we're concerned, caused too much issue, but certainly exploring it is the way forward. In terms of the development of non-authoritative support material, and I guess also to Tom's point about updating FAQs, I do wonder whether actually we need to do a little bit more here. So, for example, in the UK, we found the best approach actually was a publication covering current best practice or highlighting good practice. And whilst I do recognise this is a bit more of a challenge at an international level, potentially because of translation matters, but we obviously do have board members who speak more than one language who can help us. But I think this is actually the best way to promote market-led innovation as well and demonstrate how to avoid boilerplate, particularly when you're looking on the year on year and thinking about some of the challenges the respondents raised in the paper. So this also could address the materiality piece. And we also do have access to investor community through our CAG members, so we could engage with them directly on that. So maybe we need to think more broadly than that FAQ non-authoritative guidance in this area. So a recommendation there. In terms of 2, I agree with that. Obviously, it is part of the Going Concern Working Group's recommendations to explore this area. So no comment there. And in terms of recommendation number 5, so we're just scrolling down. I do understand that there is a need to get a better understanding from users as to the usefulness or otherwise of this materiality and scope. But as I say, if we can include that as part of that wider research that I suggested, then I think that would be a better way to look at this, as well as obviously monitoring global developments in that area. Thank you, Dan. That's all I have for those.
Thank you. Lynn?
Good evening, everybody. On recommendation 1, I support dot point 1. I think it would be a great shame to have gathered all this information and have issues being raised by people without rounding it out and providing something back to people. So I support the FAQs in that area. And I'm quite attracted to what Josephine has just said. On the second dot point, I think my preference here is to leave it jurisdictional and for different jurisdictions to work out what works best in their particular jurisdiction. On recommendation 2, I see I think we already have agreed that this is a part of the going concern work, so I support that. And just endorsing what Josephine said on recommendation 5. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you very much for working groups, especially for the Dan. I have 2 comments about 1 and 2. I understand and appreciate that issuing non-authoritative materials, FAQs, and staff alerts can be very useful for practice. However, even if they are guidance, it seems that such guidance might be substantially restrictive to the practice and almost rule-based. So I think, as mentioned by Josephine, so I think that the hierarchy or interrelationship needs to be clarified among authoritative guidance. There are various different practice among jurisdictions, which could complicate the practice. It might be better to provide examples of good practice and have practitioners refer to them. It's referred to the number 1. And recommendations number 2, the statement of material uncertainty for a going concern is based on ISO 570, not ISO 701, even though it is equivalent to CAM. However, the statements in the corresponding appendix in ISO 570 are not sufficiently descriptive in comparison with CAM. They are very important information as well as CAM, but they are boilerplate in practice. Therefore, the statements in the appendix to ISO 570 should be updated to provide sufficient explanation of material uncertainties in the going concern in the auditor's report. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Thank you, Tom, and many thanks, Dan, to you and your team for going through this and giving us a very, very good summary, easy to review. I am very supportive of all the recommendations. I am particularly interested, obviously, in the CAMs and in the first bullet. I think hopefully COVID is not where we're going to live forever. But I do think COVID this past year created some interesting interpretations of CAMs and whether COVID was a CAM or the impact of COVID is a CAM. And again, I think it could be helpful out to the practice to update the FAQs. And I really like Josephine's idea about showing what good looks like. If we have the resources that we could do that, I think that's always most impactful. So very supportive of all of them, particularly interested in the CAM discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie?
Thank you, and thanks, Dan, for and the group for the paper. As others have said, it was a easy read, easy to digest. I'm in the same place pretty much as what Diane just described, supportive of all the recommendations. I think, as Lynn stated about the rounding out the project, I do think updating or refreshing at least the FAQs would be helpful. I know they've been out there for a while and we have new information now, so that makes total sense to me. I had the same maybe niggling point about PIEs and whether that should be left to the jurisdiction, but I also see in the paper it says explore. So I'm open to exploring that and seeing where that goes as part of the PI work stream. And I guess maybe just an overall comment to talk about all the recommendations. Dan, I was thinking about ensuring there's that close coordination with the different groups as we go through this, because individually adding something to the report here or there might seem like a really good idea individually, but we probably need to also stand back collectively and make sure everything doesn't get added on as we go. So I think the paper mentioned that close coordination, and I would support that going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. An excellent paper, and to the task force. Very much this is a public interest project, and so it's important that we be seen to be responding. I think this is very responsive. Like everyone else, I thought the evidence was very well summarised, and so we don't need to bring any more evidence to the table. And I thought it was easy to support the recommendations. With the non-authoritative support material, I certainly like the idea of the best practice. I think this is an area we can leverage with the national standard setters. Very easy for me to say now that I'm not a national standard setter, so I'll dob them in. But I think it's one where we can look at best practice from each of their jurisdictions to put it together. And I think it's a project they would like to. I think certainly, looking at extending from listeds to pies. If we looked at that from the international, that will then feed back to the national jurisdictions as well. So I think that's important. The other recommendations I think are very clear, and so again, congratulations and very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Len.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dan, and the working group for the work. I really appreciate the amount of research and analysis you've done. Some of the documents that you refer in the agenda paper, I've downloaded some of them, and I found them pretty useful. So I support most of the recommendations on the slides and a lot of comments made by others. But I just want to highlight one area. I think the second bullet in recommendation 1 came for PIEs. So speaking to a number of stakeholders, I think I'm totally supportive of exploring, but I just want to make sure that the number of considerations in looking at CAM for PIEs. Number one is when we look at CAM for PIEs, it's important to look at from the user perspective. Is there demand rather than a top-down saying what is a good thing to explore? But the user of PIEs are different from user of listed companies, so it's important to make sure we've done enough work in that area. Number two, continue to think that in a number of jurisdictions, the PIE definitions are sitting in the ethics code. They're not sitting in anywhere else in regulations than law. And still a large number of countries don't use IAASB code. So when we look at CAM for PIEs, we need to make sure that we don't intendedly making requirement for a number of jurisdictions that don't have that definition or only sits in the ethics code. Number three, I think from a jurisdiction perspective, I think that's outlined in the paper, and also some of the survey responses. I think it's best to leave to the regulators and the national government to look into whether there's a need. So that's my comments, and thank you very much for great work.
Thank you, Len. Isabel.
Yes, hello everybody. First of all, I want to thank the working group for this great paper. Having been a member of the task force on key audit matter, I'm very happy to see how much now the new audit report is valued almost everywhere. On the idea of developing a non-authoritative guidance in the form of updated FAQ, I agree with that. However, I remember how challenging it has been when we issued our first FAQ on audit report. It's very difficult as a board to agree on examples, and it took us quite some time to agree on the first example we published. So I really anticipate that it's not an easy exercise, and it will require some time and maybe also some board involvement. On the idea that we can encourage people not to have boilerplate or to change key audit matter from one year to another, I'm not sure it's an objective we can reach in a guidance. And sometimes if a CAM does not change, it does not mean there is an issue. It just means the company is doing the same business, applying the same accounting principle, and having the same accounting and auditing issues. So it's not because there's no change in an auditor's report that there is a problem. So we will have to deal with that when we will issue our guidance. On the pie, so Josephine mentioned in the UK, it's already for all pie. In continental Europe, it's exactly the same. We have key audit matters for all pie. It has been challenging in very small pie, but still we have managed to make it. However, it has worked well in Europe because whenever you have a pie, you have an audit committee. And then it's very relevant because you discuss with an audit committee, you have a structured governance in the pie, and then you can determine your key audit matter. If in some jurisdictions you have pie with no audit committee, then I think it starts being very challenging, and it can be something also to consider. Regarding going concern, very supportive that this project feeds the work of the going concern working group. And on information beyond current information requested in the auditor's report, I wanted to mention two developments that we have also currently in continental Europe. One being NFI assurance, that will have to be included in the auditor's report if the work is performed by the auditor. And the other one is already there. It's XBRL, EXBRL information on which we have to opine in the auditor's report for listed companies in Europe. So I think we have to consider all this other information and the fact that now often the auditor's report is a vehicle with several chapters and financial statements being only one of the chapters. And we have more and more requests to do so. And as the companies are moving to integrated reporting, I think we have also to move to some form of integrated auditor's report and see how we can manage to have different information in the same report. Thank you.
Next is Sue.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan and the team. As others have said, excellent paper. I support all the recommendations. I particularly strongly support the piece about updating the FAQs. I think those of us with global roles are spending a lot of time as different countries come to implementation in sharing the experiences from jurisdictions that have already implemented. So I think there's huge value in doing that. I also think it provides the opportunity to update for changes that occur. I think Diane mentioned the debate that's been going on around COVID and some of the considerations there. So I think it provides flexibility and helps us maintain relevance. I also, just to perhaps respond to the comment Isabel made about the difficulty in creating examples, I also recall setting up those first FAQs. And I think we're in a very different situation now because we have a wealth of practical experience that is out there that we can draw on. So it's not that we are potentially inventing situations dry. There is material, there is experience that we can draw on to support that. So great job. And as I say, very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks, Dan, and the working group. As others have said, a very easy to read paper, very well thought out, and very easy to support. Like others, I'm broadly supportive of all of the recommendations that have been made, and just got a couple of comments or suggestions to add to the discussion. On recommendation number 1, very supportive of the continued development of non-authoritative support material relating to CAM reporting, and further to what Roger and some others have mentioned is I think as national standard setters implement the new CAM reporting across the jurisdictions, there will be an evolution of experience that can be tapped to improve and extend the non-authoritative support material on CAM. So I think continued interaction with the NSSs would be very helpful here. Similar to Julie, not totally convinced yet about the idea of CAM for PIEs, but supportive of exploring the concept in relation to the other activities that are going on around PIEs. With respect to recommendation 2 and going concern, support interacting with the working group on that. I think there was a couple of comments that came out of my outreach in that particular area, because I think one of the areas being explored was expanding the disclosures or telling a more full story around material uncertainties relating to going concern. We were not convinced that when you've got a material uncertainty that a fuller story is going to be of great additional value to users, but that's certainly worth exploring. Of more interest was really around close calls and what kind of communications could auditors provide around close call reporting. So that was something that came out of our outreach. And supportive of recommendation number 5. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thank you, Tom, and Dan and the rest of the group. Thanks a lot for the great paper. As others have said, very simple, very easy to read and understand. I'm very supportive of all the recommendations. I think the effort should not really remain only at the board level. The NSS group should get involved sooner or later. I think we all recognize that jurisdictions are at different level and the issues may not be exactly the same or with the same relevance. So that group should really help us move forward whatever papers are produced by this board, and should also help us in identifying what's more critical for that jurisdiction at the moment and work with the recommendations as the issues are progressing over the next couple of years. But great paper, very supportive again. Thanks.
Thank you. Kai Martin.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Dan, and the working group for the great research done and the summary of the work here. It provides good basis for the discussions. As others, I'm generally supportive of the recommendations. I do think the results here show that we don't have a broken standard, so there is not an urgent need to fix anything major, but there are issues that probably should be dealt with while doing the different topics that drive the issues, like going concern and others, like you recommended. Similar to what Fernando just said, I think there is benefit in having non-authoritative support materials, but it may not be us that are developing them the whole time, as there are quite a lot of jurisdictional differences when it comes to how it's done and how it's implemented. It may be difficult to get international support material that could be used all over. So updating FAQs and doing that, I'm supportive of, but going into too deep level may become difficult. As others on recommendation 1, exploring CAM for PIEs, I support. Coming from a region that already has this, as Isabel said, it works, but I think it is a jurisdictional thing rather than anything at this point. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that, Kai, your last remark about the impact of, we've heard it in other ways about regional or jurisdictional variations, is a good caution to us. So I'm glad you raised it. Kaiua?
Tom, thanks and good afternoon. First of all, Dan, let me thank you for a very good paper and a very good presentation and introduction in this issue. I agree that the post-implementation review has been completed. With respect to the way forward, I agree with the way forward as proposed, with the exception of the following for the reasons I have given in my responses to the individual recommendations. So give me a second. I will start with the comment for the first recommendation. I'm very similar to others. First, as CAM is still developing, it is unclear to me as to why authoritative support material is needed. In particular, I regard any consideration of example CAM to not be in the public interest, because such examples would be used as a template that will be lead to boilerplate. The only matter that I believe may need further guidance is how to avoid using phrases in the CAM that sounds like audit opinions when seeking to provide some form of conclusion or observation. And my second comment here is also very similar to others, since many jurisdictions already use CAMs for PIs as defined in their jurisdictions. I agree that consideration of CAM for PI should be undertaken as part of the IAASB's PI workstream. I note that there is virtually no voluntary CAM reporting by non-PIs and the public sector, so there are reasons to pursue the expansion of CAM beyond PIs. That have been my comments. Thanks, Tom. Back to you.
Thank you. Imran.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. And Dan, thank you for the excellent work. I have a story to tell about you, Dan. I'm going to say that in a minute, but I want to thank the staff who support you, Kalina and Amand, for their work here, and particularly for getting the papers to us so very early. I'd almost forgotten what I'd read and prepared for in the weeks that have since passed. But I want to start with some general comments, because I think that it's easy to support the recommendations you have on the slide. But the first was that, Dan, we have a special place for you in South Africa, because amongst the few trips you took to South Africa, you took them all in connection with this topic, auditor reporting. And I have a picture that I've just shared with you of you being here in 2015 with Arnold and Kathy. And you know who was in the audience? Willy Botha in another role. And we were talking to users in South Africa about this. And we heard from users, some who said how happy they were and some who said how nervous they were. It's amazing that 6 years have passed. We've adopted and implemented the standards. Several bodies outside of listed entities have adopted CAMs in South Africa. And really, as a reflection of your old role as Deputy Chairman of the Board and Chairman of the Audit Reporting Task Force at the time, you must be extremely proud, and when we as a board should also be extremely proud about the extent of take-up of these standards and the acceptance of the standards. And in truth, Dan, how few real issues have come up. You know, there was so much of skepticism at that time from some groups, and how those fears have not come true. And I know it's not typical for us to pat ourselves on the back in a post-implementation review, but really it's an opportunity to reflect on that. And it's also an opportunity to reflect on that as we think about further changes. Change is necessarily going to elicit a reaction from some stakeholders, but think about the unintended consequences. And you know, the word unintended consequences on a look-back basis appears almost not at all in this issues paper. It's only about new changes that people are thinking about unintended consequences. So really, I think that's a lesson unsaid in the issues paper, but one that comes from 6 years of reflection, walking this journey with you all the way back to 2015. I really thought that there was a difference in the messaging that we heard in some of this issues paper from different user groups then. And I thought that the issues paper was very clear about that. That two groups in particular, investors and regulators, were very keen on more. supporting what we were suggesting on fraud and going concern, it seemed as if they would be very happy to accept more and accept the consequences of more, whatever those consequences were. And then we had maybe another group of people who had a view, not different to the view that they had when we were promoting the original standards in 2015, boilerplating, additional work and responsibility, some concerns about cost. But our board has to be alert to the nature of change, that it's not going to stop. A few people are going to naturally take a position that is going to slow this down, but that the things that we're promoting in respect of fraud and going concern certainly must happen, and they must happen with the encouragement and enthusiasm of the people who wrote to us on this. So for this reason, I think I find some of the recommendations slightly muted. I'd like to see them, I guess I read them in a more encouraging way. I thought them to be slightly non-committal. I would thought that my own reading of them was that we should be more committed to them. And I'll comment on the specific ones in a moment, but I think that it's in the nature of the very early discussion about this. I want to mention this because, Dan, as part of one of the appendices to this paper, you reflect on what's happening elsewhere in the world. And I know that you and the team, together with Billy, spent some time with Kumu and my team talking about our recent consultation paper on extended auditor reporting in South Africa. We know that there's a lot of this happening. The benefit we have in South Africa is we have some first-hand experience of the proposals we made. And of course, that issues paper describes what the 8 proposals we made in South Africa. The analysis is still pending, but we got the largest ever response to a consultation in South Africa. We've never had, other than on MAFR, we've never had this many people write back to us enthusiastic about the set of proposals we were making. So I really thought that we should, I appreciate that auditor reporting's post-implementation review look back, but the audiences that wrote to us, the stock exchanges, the investor groups, the regulator bodies, and many, many audit firms, generally then looked to see how we can build on the success we had with the new audit reports and CAM. And that's why these recommendations and others will be supportive. I think the thing that they say to us is, if you have it in your audit file, why not share it with us? We don't expect you to do more work, but share these messages with us. I think one of the early comments, though, they come with all of the 7 or 8 recommendations we're going to talk today, is that Tom, you mentioned in your opening remarks that we have to think about how this affects the work program, and how does this fit into an agenda that's already very full. I think Willie has another problem, and that is this due process related to all of the working groups working in parallel here. The fraud working group, the going concern working group, the professional skepticism working group, the one related to IT and data analytics, and which working group takes priority amongst these working groups in us giving them instructions. I'd love to hear some reaction and thoughts to Billy about this, because it seems like we throw them, your group then has done its work and then it passes them on, but maybe the other groups were not expecting this, or they've moved forward, or they're not yet there to pick it up. And I wonder whether we aren't, unnecessarily wasting some time when there's a clear steer on some of these topics. I want to highlight 1 or 2 other things, and really just this paragraph 3 of this auditor reporting post-implementation, where you describe the scope of this PIR. Dan, I think that this may be one of the best descriptions of a PIR I have ever seen. And we're reflecting on how we can use this in our own work. I think it's fantastically written as to what we're trying to do. And importantly, Tom, it links it extremely well to our framework of activities, which was an abstraction before. And paragraph 3 really describes it extremely well. So I wanted to just call that out. The great paragraphs are very, very hard to write, but I can imagine, Dan, you and the team, you had a strong hand in drafting that. While there, I also thought that we should reflect on what the objectives were for our project. And I want to be a little bit critical that if our goal in the 3rd and 4th objectives were to understand the extent of global demand, I think it's a little bit unfair to come to the end of the project and say that we are still exploring the interest or global demand for it. How then do we conclude that we have met the objective the project. So I appreciate that I'm reading the words very closely. Either we've understood or not understood. If we've not yet understood, then are we really concluding this, or is there a little bit more still to be done? While dealing with these preliminary issues, I really would wonder when Karen speaks with us later, if Karen can remind us whether the PIOB had identified any public interest issues within this post-implementation review, as we commonly have the discussion nowadays about the PIOB's PI issues. I say this because we all remember that when the PIOB confirmed the auditor reporting standards, we got that paragraph from them in their letter on the subject of going concern. And that was a very significant statement from the PIOB, that we didn't just get a vanilla endorsement of the standards. We got their statement saying that they wished we'd done more in an area around going concern. And I think that they may have an interest to hear what have we learned through the post-implementation review directly related to what could be described as their reservation 5 years ago. That said, I am really supportive of recommendation 1, and I think that there's a very strong steer in the evidence that you've gathered regarding the subject matter of PIEs, and particularly support what I heard Josephine say about this. It's also very supportive of recommendation number 2 with the proviso that I just made regarding the PIOB comment. And in respect of recommendation number 5, I fall in the camp that suggests we could do more, but certainly as a baseline, that is very much what we need at the moment. So thank you very much, Dan. Really, very positive about what's happening here and the value that auditor reporting has brought to the world, and a message that we don't fall behind while many territories are moving ahead. Thank you.
Okay, Kai, did you take your hand down?
Thanks. So I have forgotten to express my support for recommendation 2 and 5, and that was the idea to bring this out. I only have a very quick response to recommendation 2. It's regarding to the going concern issue. But I think this is not. It's an important point, but it's a point which I can send to Dan offline. Thanks, Tom.
The one other thing is, as a part of this conversation on the CAM stuff, remember, as part of our discussion on PI and going forward and disclosure and our case-by-case consideration, some of it will be subsumed in that consideration, or at least that's the plan going forward, because that is an area of differential requirements. So I just keep a reminder of that as sort of seeing how these link with other activities. Karen?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Amron, for really allowing me to jump in. I think, Amron, you said a lot of the things that the PIOB is thinking. You know, there's always a nervousness when you open up a recent standard that was very controversial at the time. There was a lot of concern that CAMs would be misinterpreted, lead to confusion, weren't necessary. And the review is good in the fact that the feedback that it's got has clearly showed the value that the work that the board took on at that time has produced. And whenever you open up a standard that was difficult to bring to ground, there's a worry that you could relitigate or undo the good work that was accomplished. So it was really, really helpful to see how the feedback was very much acceptance and what I kind of called no fatal flaws. The PIOB really looks forward to how you are going to incorporate the prioritization of these recommendations with the other work that you have. We are wondering how, with the resources that exist, you can accomplish all the things on your plate, and look forward to how this will be prioritized through the framework. And the last thing I would say is about going concern. The PIOB is very positive about the fact that you've taken on a project on going concern. And we're very hopeful that that work will dovetail into what was required or not required, but what the PIOB was looking for in the original auditor reporting. And so the question about coordination between working groups is important, but you have a group already set up on going concern. Is it possible to just take the feedback and filter it into that work, filter it into the PI work, filter it into the fraud work? I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And I think that's particularly as it relates to going concern and any impact and auditor reporting. I think that's the intent going forward. And obviously we'll allow our due process to play out and determine what the appropriate outcome is from a public interest perspective. Okay, Josephine, I see your hands up, and then I want to sort of bring this section to conclusion. My guess is since this was the first round, we got more input here than we will on future questions. Josephine.
Thanks, Tom. I guess in some ways you've already responded to Karen. I just wanted to respond to your point. We are and have very much worked with Dan and the rest of the team on the feedback received in respect to going concern, and we have included that in our analysis that we presented to the board, and we'll continue working with them and make sure we do a deeper dive into the feedback that they've received as we go through our process there. So just wanted to confirm that that is in fact the case. Thank you.
Okay, Dan, my take is you got broad support for the recommendations here. Josephine and others pointed out some potential value of, in the context of FAQs, some best practice examples. I did think we got some sort of diverging comments about the desire to go further or the risk of going further. And we'll have to balance that with our resource concerns as well. Clearly, going concern working group, as you heard, is taking a bit of that on themselves too, on a recommendation too, which seems like the appropriate place to go. I turn it back to you to react and to move forward afterwards.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and thanks so much to all of the board members for all of your input and certainly for your support of the recommendations and all of your very positive comments about the process and the paper. So thank you very much for that. Not much to react to. As Tom said, these were all good data points that now will be further considered, frankly, by other work streams, going concern, the PI work stream, as they further explore matters relating to auditor reporting. In terms of the FAQs, much support for updating those. I know the working group talked a little bit about examples, and for the same reason that Kaiua mentioned, examples have in the past have been difficult because they tend to become the accepted, and therefore it's sometimes difficult to agree on examples. But there may be opportunity for, in updating the FAQs, to have a look at example wording and example practices, kind of to the point that Josephine was making. In order to kind of further provide positive guidance and support for those auditors that are working on communicating CAM. Just one final point before we move on, and that Imran, I want to thank you for all of your comments and reflections on the process and kind of the favorable outcome of all of this. I did want to comment on your point on the global demand, and clearly one of the objectives of the PIR was to gauge the extent of global demand for additional information in the auditor's report. And here we are at the end saying that further time is needed to explore developments. I do think, and the working group thought, that that is consistent and reflective of what was heard through all of the information gathering activities. It's not just the survey. It came through in the academic research. It came through in the comments from participants at the roundtable. And that is, in those jurisdictions where they've already gone a little bit further and have included information about materiality and audit scope and the like, it seems to be working well. But there was not much indication through the information gathering process that demand was extending to other jurisdictions, and therefore the working group came to the conclusion that it's still a matter of interest and a matter of public interest, and therefore more time needed to reflect and look at experiences and what's happening in other parts of the world would be the best approach. I'm glad, Imran, you pointed to supplement C, which I didn't refer to earlier, and the consultation that you're doing in South Africa was mentioned as a part of that. And I think that's reflective of the current environment and the fact that there's still interest by stakeholders in pursuing additional information in the auditor's report. And that's just one example of a jurisdiction that is now exploring it, and therefore the need for continued monitoring of these global developments. So I just wanted to clarify that point. So I think, Tom, we can move on then to the next slide here. And this may be a topic that will generate some conversation, other information. I would say there's more details that were provided in section 6 of the paper. And on the positive side, the overall responses indicated that the other information section is useful. The responses did vary by stakeholder group, and the investors and regulators were a little less indicating or supportive of the usefulness of the other information section. Investors in particular, I think, said, well, if there were any inconsistencies with the audited financial statements, that would be of interest. But as others have mentioned, interests of users, sometimes lie in other types of non-financial information. But be that as it may, the support was there for the inclusion of this other information section, but there were a number of challenges that were noted, and arguably this was the area where the most implementation challenges were noted by respondents to the survey in particular. The paper described the 5 areas where those challenges have arisen. Those areas are also on the slide here, so I won't go through them in any detail. As I said, there's further explanation in section 6 of the paper. The working group did note that some of these challenges already have been addressed in some way by national standard setters or others through guidance that's been issued at the jurisdictional level. Supplement A to the materials gave some further information about a deeper dive on what has been done in that regard. About half of national standard setters and public accountancy organizations, mostly in Europe and in Asia Pacific, have done something at the jurisdictional level. And mostly it's to provide jurisdiction-specific guidance or examples about what constitutes other information or other helpful guidance for auditors in navigating through the requirements in ISO 720 revised. all of this led the working group through its discussion to say that further engagement was needed with national standard setters and others, looking for ways to leverage what has already been done at the jurisdictional level, and see whether there may be scope for updating FAQs or exploring other types of education and guidance. But clearly the working group was focused on what had been done at the jurisdictional level and looking for opportunities to leverage what had been done there. But beyond that, because of the nature of the challenges and the concerns that had been raised, the working group did come to the conclusion that non-authoritative guidance alone may not be sufficient to address the identified issues, and therefore a part of the recommendation was for the IAASB to explore whether targeted revisions to ISO 720 may be needed as part of the future work plan, and believe that has been included as a possibility in the draft work plan that's been discussed by the board. So with that as the introduction, Tom, if we could go to the next slide. And again, without getting into a lot of detail about the challenges, the board has asked for its views on recommendation 3 with respect to other information, which has two parts, and that's exploring the development of additional guidance, FAQs or otherwise, but leveraging where possible the good guidance that's already been developed by national standard setters. And then the second prong here is considering targeted revisions to ISO 720 as part of the future work plan.
Thank you, Dan. And so what I would suggest here is just to remind people that to some extent the second bullet was implicit in our analysis yesterday, in our work plan yesterday, because it was incorporated, as I remember, into the future topics, but this may have an impact on the way you think about that consideration. So I'll take hands now and see if people want to comment. Kaiwe.
Tom, thanks very much. Dan, I agree with additional guidance on ISO 720, but I'm not convinced that guidance alone will be enough. Some further clarifications need to be authoritative and therefore within the standard. Second comment, I believe it to be in the public interest to engage in targeted revisions to ISO 720, in particular in relation to the wording and meaning of the definition of annual report. The application material may also need to provide further clarification of auditor responsibilities with respect to information on the internet and what the impact of references from the financial statements to information or references from other informations to further information may have. I also believe that the other information section may need to be responded and reworded to make it clearer. Furthermore, consideration is also needed about other information not available until after the auditor's report has been issued. There's often very little that auditors can legally do once their report has been issued. That has been my comment. Thanks. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kai. Josephine.
Thank you. So similar to Kai, I would agree that given the feedback from respondents, I also feel that guidance just won't be sufficient to address all the issues and challenges noted by our stakeholders with respect to the other information section. Maybe using Imran's words, I think I felt that consider was slightly non-committal, but as you say, it is reflected in our framework for activities. So perhaps we are more committed to it than perhaps that language suggests. I was struck by comments such as concerns about the use of technical language and the overall complexity of the OI section, which Kai also mentioned. And certainly there's something there that we could actually address. And the placement of the section potentially exacerbating concerns that there's an implication that assurance is actually being provided on the other information. I found that quite interesting. And maybe to your point yesterday, Tom, in respect to technology, perhaps we need to shift our mindset and move away from our traditional view of where everything needs to be placed and rethink about the reporting on that other information and whether the auditor's report, don't panic everybody, whether the auditor's report is in fact the right place or whether it's just the position in the auditor's report which is causing the issue and you know, really test that. So yeah, essentially just worried about the language being a bit soft here. I would like to see some targeted revisions based on the feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess we're talking about semantics here a little bit on consider, but the reality is that we have a process for consideration. This should be an input to that process. We can't consider this in isolation. And I think that's, Dan, that's the intent, that why you use that word, is that we add things to our work plan in the context of all the other priorities that we're being asked to deal with.
Yeah, that is exactly right, Tom. And when the working group was going through the process of developing these recommendations, obviously didn't have the benefit of all of the information underlying the development of the future work plan, and therefore the notion of considering targeted revisions was exactly that it had to be a part of the overall reflection by the board on what was heard through the work plan process in determining the moving forward on any targeted revisions.
Thank you. So I hope people take that. I get the concern about the word consider, but that's the context. If you disagree with that's the process by which we take it up, then let us know. Roger?
Yeah, I will respond to it that it is appearing in our strategy document as one of the work projects for consideration. So it's a matter of where it lies in the priority list. I would say on the basis of this, it should be high priority on the basis that we've got the work. This is the most extensive post-implementation review that I can remember the IAASB has done. It would be good to see the actions coming quickly out of the post-implementation review rather than being pushed back a number of years where we have that feedback. We have a lot of the research that is done already for the framework for activities. So it is more progressed than a lot of the other ones fielding into that particular part of the funnel. The feedback where we've got 48% or whatever it is of national standard setters changing the standard or amending the standard in some way, that's quite a large amount. Most national standard setters will not change a standard unless they really have some evidence that it is necessary. So I think we can leverage off that. So I am very much in favour of leveraging off the national standard setters, undertaking targeted revisions. I would see this as a priority. I think it would be a good signal to do out of this public interest post-implementation review. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
So I support the recommendation. I just wanted to share that when I was doing some of the outreach in preparation for this, there was slightly mixed feedback around the prioritisation and timeline, really.
Some people saw this as really, really important, very urgent, particularly given all the changes in the kind of non-financial information that we talked about yesterday coming through. Others who were perhaps in the jurisdictions that are going through changes were just nervous about the kind of constant change to the auditor's report and the impact that would have. But as I say, personally, I support this and support the consideration and working it through the framework. Thanks.
Thank you. Next is Len.
Thank you, Tom. I just want to thank the working group. This is the part of the paper I actually learned quite a lot, and also the
Len, we're losing you. You're coming in and out. Len, you're coming in and out.
National.
We can't hear you. I'll come back to Len.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello?
Yes, maybe turn off your video. Okay. Better.
Can you hear me now? You can? Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I was saying that this is part of the paper, the agenda paper I enjoy reading the most, especially on the supplemental A, some of the national standard setters guidance. In my limited outreach, I think when we look at the 130 countries using ISIS, you'll be amazed that the number of jurisdictions have now adopted 720.
We're gonna have to come back to you, Len. The connection is very poor. Let's see if we could remedy it, and we'll come back to you at the end. Ada?
Yes, thank you, Tom. And let me start with thanking Dan and the task force for the work they've done and a great issues paper to bring it to life and reflect on it. I agree with most of the recommendations, but this is an area where I felt compelled to potentially have a different point of view. And if I consider particularly the users of the financial statements, and that being the investors and the regulators, which were critical or
number of reasons that has been cited in the
I'm gonna put you on mute now. Come on, Ada.
Also, the challenges that were perceived by the practice and national standard setters doing their own either additions or modifications to it. Some of them may not have implemented it yet. I wonder whether in the context of 720 our objective was met. And I probably also gonna and then this is just a question I have. I haven't seen any evidence that clearly suggests it has, whereas on all the other areas I do strongly feel that we have. This is and I say this as I think this is a great opportunity, particularly in light of the importance of non-financial information that is increasing in importance for the user group. And clearly 720 has a certain work effort, where it may not be particularly well understood what type of work effort the auditors do, and what underpins and then to what extent investors or users of the financial statement can take comfort of. So I'm just thinking back, and I'm wondering whether there's something more we can do and create a bit of a framework on other information and clarify what we do on what information in the other parts of the annual reporting. Certain examples come to mind, like comfort letters, where we circle stuff around. That is probably not a solution here, but I think it is worthwhile to think further on this, but again, against the backdrop what we discussed yesterday, the non-financial and the climate information, where further clarity will be expected. And I agree, or I recognize that for some of those national standard setters will require a certain level of assurance, in Europe, for example. So that will be covered by a separate standard. But then there's this other stuff, and certain jurisdictions may not require assurance on climate or ESG or non-financial information. So here I would challenge whether this can be re-evaluated further. I agree with Roger that this will come out of or needs to find a place in the work plan. And I do think this is important. We've now done our work, and I think the task force has done a great job in summarizing and performing the research on what the constituents, the stakeholders think. And I think it is time for us to pick up the challenge and show us what we're worth. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Diane.
Yep. So I'll have a different view on this, and that's principally based upon my personal bias of being in the U.S. I mean, I struggle with this topic. I struggle with how important this is. I just don't appreciate it. I don't have a good appreciation of it. I also am concerned that there's a fair amount of jurisdictional preferences that may make it difficult to come up with an international harmonized approach to this. So I am in very strong favor of the word consider. I think based upon our discussion yesterday with the work plan, when I think of this topic versus things like analytical procedures and sampling, I will naturally move to the analytical procedures and sampling topic. So just, again, my perspective is coming out of the US. I don't see this as a significant matter. I would encourage us to keep it in the consider category, weighing all the other things that we need to get done. And those are just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Isabel.
Yes, thank you. It took me some time to decide whether I would say something or not, because some would remember I was assisting Cedric as technical advisor when he was leading ISA 720 with a great Dan fixing the standard at that time. I'm not surprised that a lot of national standard setters had to amend, supplement, adjust the standard. Because for me, this topic is very linked to the corporate law existing in a country. And so the challenge we had, and it took us some time at the time we developed the draft, is to try to think something big enough, customizable enough, so that each NSS and each country can make it its own while adjusting it to the local context. So maybe it's a standard of a different nature, and we should not try to find a solution that fits all, because I believe on this topic, never one size will fit all. I'm not saying nothing needs to be modified on this standard, and that's the interest of doing this post-implementation review. But I'm not sure that we will be able to find the golden bullet to solve everything. Maybe we have to keep the standard high level enough, customizable enough, so that each country can make the practice its own. And I think that was the interest of this standard. And remember where we started at the beginning. We had a work effort with no reporting, and there was an expectation that some reporting should exist somewhere. And then we struggled with all the local diversities, and that's where we landed. So strong agreement to work on it, but not sure, but we will find one size that will fit all needs. Thank you.
Okay, Julie.
Thanks, Tom. And I just wanted to come in to strongly support the recommendations of the working group here. I won't repeat what others have said in their support because it's the exact same comments, but I will say as a practitioner and as someone who has had to provide guidance to other practitioners on this standard, it has been one of the harder ones to implement, maybe one of the hardest ones in the auditor reporting standards to implement. And I agree with the 5 bullets you have in the issues paper there, Dan, as to the issues. And so I think it's a reasonable one that would make its way to the work plan as resources provide for it. And yeah, and also reflecting back on our discussion about emerging issues yesterday in our work plan, I do think this is another one that has a tie to non-financial information and what's going to ultimately be reported in the future. And so I do think we need some clarity in the standard on how all that works. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric?
I just want to echo what Julie just said. This has been a tough area, but I think it's also one that's going to continue to be a challenge as the future of assurance evolves and the relationship of this standard with those developments. And so, support the recommendation to continue to work on guidance and considering the implications of whether changes are needed to this standard as the other non-financial information material evolves. So very supportive of where Julie ended up. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. I know this is an important topic that everyone would like to comment on, so thank you for that. We also have to be slightly mindful of time. We're about halfway through the recommendation and an hour and a half through the session right now. Dan, turn it back to you. I think in many ways, effectively support for the recommendations, though, I think where people slightly give nuances is what's next as a result, because there's a range of possibilities resulted from that recommendation.
Yes, that's right. That's right, Tom. And again, thanks to all of the board members for your input. I think the takeaway on this one is that, as the working group had suggested, we'll have a look at the frequently asked questions and the guidance, jurisdictional guidance that has been issued to see how that might be leveraged. But then, it's now the baton has been handed to the board in the consideration of the future work plan as to how any further actions on other information might fit in there. So that does take us to the next slide. And just a couple of introductory comments before we get to this particular point. This is now recommendation 4, and recommendation 4 came out of the working group's consideration of the information gathering and the responses with respect to other elements of the auditor's report. And just a broad comment there, overall, the form and structure of the revised auditor's report has been very well received. Opinion section first, followed by the basis for opinion. There were some comments about the length of the auditor's report and the standardized wording, particularly on the management and auditor responsibilities sections. But by and large, stakeholders across the board were supportive of the new form of auditor's report. And on the, we'll call it the standardized wording in the responsibility sections, the working group did note the board discussions when these standards were issued, and particularly the board's concern about making sure that there was consistency in the wording across all auditors' reports. So the working group did take that into consideration. There was one matter that did come up as a part of the feedback on the other elements, and that relates to this matter about an individual other than the engagement partner signing the auditor's report. So it's been affectionately referred to as the signing partner issue. And this is discussed more fully in section 7 of the paper. And I won't go into, again, all of the background and the history on this, which is explained in the paper, but just quickly, it was an issue that goes all the way back to the invitation to comment in December 2015. And at that time, the majority were not supportive of doing anything to address this particular issue. The board did have further discussions about it in connection with the revisions to ISA 220. And there's a reference to the June 2018 meeting in the paper. And the board at that time concluded that further explanation was needed about the matter. And that further explanation, or the further explorations, pardon me, was done through a survey that was coordinated by the External Reporting Board of New Zealand. And many thanks to Lynn, to you and to Sylvia and your colleagues for all of the work that was done on sending out that survey, analyzing the results and coming up with the findings and the recommendations. So if either of you would like to comment on this, as was the board is discussing it, please feel free to do that. Supplement B to the materials here gave a little bit more background about that survey, who responded, why these situations occur, examples of policies and practices in place in different jurisdictions, and of course the XRB's conclusion about the findings from the survey. Interestingly, there were 64 respondents from 12 jurisdictions that did respond. So it was indicative to the working group that this issue is out there. It exists in several jurisdictions. Practices do vary. As indicated on the slide, there may be local law and regulation that contain further requirements about who should sign and the expected involvement of a signing partner. The working group did come to the conclusion that a non-authoritative guidance in this area would be helpful. The recommendation refers to a staff publication, but it doesn't need to be an IAASB staff publication. There could be certainly other options for the form of this guidance and who might take responsibility for developing it. Paragraph 91 of the paper does include some views of the working group on what this guidance might include. So I won't go into that in detail, but at the highest level, it might address the engagement partner's overall responsibility in accordance with ISA 220 revised, and then what the responsibilities of the signing partner might be. And there is some jurisdictional guidance out there that may be helpful as a baseline in going through this process. So if we can go to the next slide, Tom, it's looking for the board's views on this particular recommendation relating to non-authoritative support material for this signing partner matter.
Okay. Comments on recommendation 4. And again, just conscious of time, if you agree with what's been said, you can get on the record that you agree, but we'll try to be conscious of time here a little bit. Len.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you to Lynn and Sylvia. I think this is a great survey, and this is one area I'm actually thinking about, that all your recommendations is on point, the ISO 220 linkage, and also the non-authoritative guidance might help to resolve some of the situations. But in principle, I think paragraph 10, the number of bullets you listed in your supplement B, I think all those need to be in the non-authoritative guidance. I think the signing partner, whoever signs the report, has to take responsibility. They have to perform review on work documentations. I think everything you summarize in the paper is right, hitting the right spot. So congratulations on the finding, and fully supportive of exploring the next option. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. I had some slight reservations on this particular recommendation, mainly based on I wasn't quite sure just how prevalent this was. The paper talks about 12 jurisdictions and 30% indicating instances where this occurs. So just in the interests of there's a lot that we've got to prioritise. I just wondered whether this needed to be quite up there. Thanks.
Thanks. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. My comment is as follows. Who is equitable to sign an auditor's report in a particular jurisdiction is very much a jurisdictional matter based on local law, regulations, and matters such as firms' corporate status or partnership agreements. This is a situation, for example, in many countries in Europe. Whether an individual otherwise ought to be able to sign is at the end an ethical matter involving the appropriateness of the individual's association with the auditor's report through the signature. I'm therefore not convinced that such guidance would necessarily be applicable across jurisdictions or be a matter that only the IAASB can set forth without consulting IAASB. For these reasons, I'm hesitant about supporting non-authoritative guidance on this matter at the IAASB. Thanks, that's all.
Thank you. Diane?
I am in the same camp as Sue and Kaiue. I think this is very much a jurisdictional issue. And again, I don't see this as a priority. Thank you.
Okay, Josephine?
Yep, I am in the same camp as Sue, Kai, and Diane. I think actually the amount of cautionary language as well that we would have to put into this guidance so as not to undermine any of our quality management arrangements could be quite hefty, and therefore not really deliver anything that's of any use. It should really remain at jurisdictional level. So low priority at the most, but frankly, I'm not really supportive of exploring this further. Thank you.
Maybe what I'd like to hear is anyone disagree with that this is a low priority or not a priority for the reasons that we've heard. So anyone who want to say something different, and maybe by physical show of hands. I saw Kai, Wharton, and Lynn. Lynn, you're the one with a hand up still. So do you have a different point of view?
Yes, Tom, I do. And I've had a different point of view from the board the entire time, so this won't be new to anyone who was around on the board in terms of 220. For those of us who have been in this situation, often in a jurisdiction there is no guidance, and I think there is some common thinking and some common points, as Len pointed out, that would be helpful to put into the public arena. I obviously will go with the board's majority thoughts, but for, in the public sector, it is an absolute issue, and it's certainly in large parts of Asia, as Len knows, it's also a significant issue. So I've said my piece. I've put the work in, and thanks very much to Sylvia for all the work that was put into that survey. I do appreciate it, Sylvia, but I'll go with where the board goes at this stage, because the information is at worst in these papers in public arena.
Okay, thanks, Len. I'm glad you raised that point on the public record. But I do get a sense for the majority that either this is a low priority recommendation or a priority in the near term, considering all the other things we're asked to do. Is that a fair interpretation? Okay, nods, notwithstanding Len's comments, which we should note. Len?
Yeah, I think in terms of board priority, it is a low priority, so I would support board's decision. But I think what we have in the issues paper, also in supplemental B, is actually very useful information already. How we can use that information to generate awareness. I think that would be a possible option. So definitely it's a low priority for international standard setting boards such as us. But I think the good work has been done. We should find a way to share that information would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I think, Dan, we got some guidance here. I turn it back to you.
Yes, thanks, Tom. And the steer was very clear from the board here. I would only add that the working group was attempting to be responsive to what was heard during this post-implementation review process, and including the additional survey that had been done by the XRB, which was done with the intention of trying to inform any possible discussions or actions by the IAASB. So in this regard, the working group's recommendation only was what's the best way to acknowledge and respond to what has been heard, and the calls for guidance from these jurisdictions. Clearly, it is confined to a number of specific jurisdictions, so there may be opportunity to further engage with national standard setters on this. But the steer was very clear, Tom, in terms of the board actually or staff taking this on as a priority at the moment. So that does take us then to the last group of recommendations, and hopefully this one will go fairly quickly, because the previous discussion actually has touched on some of these final recommendations, 6, 7, 8, and 9. The slide that you see here, one of the areas that was explored in the survey was whether to align assurance reports for other engagements with the form and structure of the auditor's report. And there's a little bit more detail on this in section 9 of the paper. Essentially, there was some demand for doing so, but it was not widespread. If anyone was talking about it, it was to say it might make sense to, in these other assurance reports, to have the opinion or the conclusion first, followed by the basis for opinion or basis for conclusion, maybe a separate section with an independent statement. Those were the points that came up most frequently. There was little to no support for communicating key audit matters in those reports, but there were a number of comments that came in about ISRE 2410, probably in two areas. One was enhancing the consistency of the reports for interim reviews with the auditor's report on the full year financial statements. And then some discussion about the inconsistency of treatment for reporting purposes of a material uncertainty related to going concern in the interim review report compared to the full year auditor's report. So the working group's recommendation here was to explore this matter further, the matter of alignment, when the related standards are next proposed for revision by the board. But specifically with respect to ISRE 2410, to have a look perhaps in the near term at updating the FAQs to clarify the treatment of the material uncertainty for going concern in the interim review report, and then wherever the board might go in its revision with ISRE 2410 to have a further look at alignment when that is done. The next slide really needs no further discussion. It's already been a part of the thread of the discussion this morning. Clear support from the board for updating the auditor reporting FAQs in those areas where some of the practical challenges have been identified and experienced. And the working group did think, as I mentioned earlier, that this would be a targeted and timely and effective response to the feedback that was received. And then the next slide is the kind of the final round of discussion before the way forward here. And that's just to get the board's input on this last batch of recommendations. Recommendation number 9 was another one of those that has been touched on in different ways throughout the course of the discussion this morning, engaging with stakeholders, monitoring global developments and experiences, as well as recommendation 8 in providing support to and close coordination with the other IAASB working groups, going concern, fraud, and PI. So with that, Tom, we'll turn it back to you and the board for any views or observations on this last group of recommendations.
And you are right that we seem to have covered a number of those in the initial discussions as well. So I guess what we're really looking for is additional color or any concerns about the proposed path or clarifications that the board would think is required. Any comments? Isabel.
I want to support all recommendations, but I think we need to focus specifically on what has been said on 2410. 2410 is not a standard in isolation. It's not a standard that is used by few jurisdictions. It's used everywhere, and it's used for the more strategic entities because it's often listed entities, PI, have requirements to have a review of their interim financial statements. And more, we see that our standard 2410 is to some extent obsolete, at least in the format. And we can see it more and more anytime we make a revision to another standard. It was discussed this week when we made the conforming change related to ISA 600. And we decided to leave the concept of significant component in 2410 because we don't touch 2410 anymore, not to have it half revised and half not revised. And now we see also this request to align the treatment of going concern in 2410 with the revisions we have made in 570, and also the request to have the format be changed. So I think more and more, and year after year, this topic of modernizing 2410 should arrive among the priorities. So I know it's in the bucket of 8 projects that we discussed already, but really a lot of people are claiming that they want 2410 to be modernized, and it's something we should consider as a priority. Thank you.
Yeah, that comment makes me think about maybe the need for us to be more artful in the way we, and this is something that was raised yesterday, in the way we demonstrate the level of priority for the next up projects in our work plan. Okay, Roger?
I'm coming in to support prioritising 2410 as well. It's an issue that's been brought up at national standard setters meetings. The standard is out of date, especially in this area. We have the situation for listed entities in Australia, for example, where we can give a material uncertainty for related going concerns at the end of a year, but you can't give it at half year. So you have to go back to some other alternative, and it just creates a lot of inconsistency and misconception with the public. So Australia has dealt with that, but certainly think 2410 is certainly in need of a look at sometime. So I would have it up on the priority list. Thank you. Supporting Isabel.
Yeah, sort of the way I'm thinking about it is, you think we did try to indicate this from the work streams. Like, it seems like 330, 2410, and assurance of whatever that the immediate action would be, sort of like the top ones in each of those buckets right now, based upon what we're hearing. I'm not categorizing them relative to each other yet. Sue?
Yeah, so I was going to say I see recommendation 6 as being possibly a lower priority if we're looking for priorities, with the exception of 2410 for all the reasons that the others have just said. I think that is a high priority. Thanks.
Okay. Imran?
Thank you. On recommendation 6, I agree with those who've spoken before me about giving it a greater priority, 2410. On recommendation 7, I have a question of clarification. Please, Dan, are we suggesting that the discussion about CAM observation and outcomes should be incorporated within an FAQ or a standalone document? It was just unclear to me. On recommendation 8, I support what we're asking, but as I said earlier, I'm unclear about how all of this is going to come together in the future. I think we may have a process problem, not a due process problem, a process problem developing, that if one working group or task force is waiting for another, it consults with another, and the other one waits for yet another, this will get pretty sticky and convoluted. Items that have already been canvassed are going to be re-canvassed, re-exposed, and processes like this don't take months, they take years that could pass us by. And in order of precedence, I'm not sure which of the projects is actually in the lead. Will it be post-implementation review, going concern, fraud, professional skepticism, PI? So there's some kind of process issue developing here that I'm sure the staff will take a note of and guide us along. Especially sometimes when a working group is actually not working on a project, but merely exists as a collection of individuals interested in a topic. And then things get referred to them, but they don't have a project proposal that they're working on. And then it will just go there to settle and collect dust instead of moving forward. On recommendation number 9, then really a suggestion that in substance, 9 doesn't seem to differ much from number 5. And with Kumo and I thought that there was a good case to shorten these recommendations by merging 9 with number 5. And in fact, the overall conversation between 9 and 5 is about consistency. And the other word you used slips my mind at the moment, informative auditor reporting. And I thought that there was a way actually to make them into one recommendation, because the discussion really supports, the discussion that follows both of them supports each recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaioi?
Tom, thanks. My response to recommendation 6 is that I'm not in favor of aligning the form, structure, and presentation of other assurance reports with the auditor's report for the following reasons. First, the review report as set forth in ISRE 2400 was intentionally designed to have a different form, structure, and presentation than the auditor's report, so as to help reduce the confusion among users between audits and reviews. Seeking to align the form, structure, and presentation would therefore defeat the very purpose for which the review report was designed to be different. These considerations should also be taken into account when revising ISRE 2410. Second reason, the other assurance, sorry, that's a mistake. The other assurance engagements under IAASB 3000 and its related standards do not require a particular form, structure, or presentation. The requirements allow considerable flexibility on these matters on purpose, so that different forms, structures, and presentation can be used. This means that if practitioners or national standard setters desire to align the form, structure, and content with those of the auditor's report, there are no barriers to them doing so. For this reason, there does not appear to be any need to undertake a project to align the reports for the other assurance engagements. However, I do see the need to consider whether some guidance in relation to going concern matters for reviews might be helpful. My comment to recommendation 7 is as follows. The question arises whether an FAQ can respond to some of the issues that have arisen. If there is some confusion about the interpretation of the auditor's reporting standards, this suggests that targeted revisions to the standards may be more appropriate. And Tom, I agree and support recommendation 8 and 9. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. So unfortunately, I actually disagree with Caillou. We held on as long as possible before we actually revised 2410, and we really did, because we really wanted it to happen at an international level, and after a while realized it wasn't going to happen in quick time, so we had to revise it. And it was because of the pressure from practitioners and others that the standard was just unusable compared to current requirements in order to reporting, and just generally because it's old and slightly broken in respect of going concern, as Roger has very, very clearly pointed out. So I would like to see that as high priority as well. Thank you.
So Edo nodding his head. I think he's about to emphasize that point. Edo?
Indeed, that was all I was going to do, and others have made the point. Sue as well. I think she put it very clear. So I'm just with Josephine and Sue on this. Indeed, thank you.
Okay, Dan, that's the last of the hands. One of the things too, Imran raised a process point. I think it's something relevant to any coordination efforts that we have at the with standard setting. And I just wonder, Billy, since we were sort of prompted on how we'll manage these things, and we do, if you wanted to come in before Dan responds in total.
Thank you, Tom. And I think Imran raised the same point a little bit earlier in the discussion today as well. I I think when we looked at this, and Josephine pointed out that there's already been a high level of coordination, especially between the going concern group and the PI group and the auditor reporting group, is that when we reflected on all of this, we said, well, we've got three concurrent projects running at the moment: the PI project, the fraud project, the going concern project. And it just makes sense that those projects also explore within the context of those subject matters the auditor reporting issue for each of those topics. Because I think we concluded as well that, you know, we need to be careful not to see transparency through the auditor's report as isolated. Because whatever we need, whatever may go into the auditor's report on going concern, for example, will be very closely linked to the changes we actually make in the standard relating to going concern. And that's why we felt that those groups are probably better placed to take this forward, obviously still with the support and input from the auditor reporting implementation group. But Imran's point is certainly not lost on me. I think Julie made the same point, that we need to be careful from a coordination point of view, that we don't end up with separate little pieces that are being added to the auditor's report. So we will be very conscious of that as we go through this process and see and then trying to be innovative in terms of how any changes that come through can be aligned in terms of things coming through the auditor's report. But I think our biggest driver was that the focus are on these topics, and these topics will also flow through to transparency in the auditor's report, and that package is important. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Billy. Dan.
Yes, thanks, Tom. And I think just a couple of comments to close off this particular discussion. On 2410, that is now in the hands of the board in terms of further discussions on that as part of the work plan. Imran, I did want to respond to the couple of points that you had raised. First one was on the FAQs with respect to outcomes and observations. And what the task force had in mind in that regard is described in paragraph 43 of the paper. And it's basically simply to acknowledge what's in the current standards in ISO 701, that 701 doesn't prohibit the auditor from communicating additional information about a CAM, including outcomes or observations, but there's some cautionary language in the application material in 701 about the auditor taking care just to make sure that nothing is communicated about the outcome that would give the impression that giving a separate opinion on a particular matter. It's the piecemeal opinion question. So the working group thought that that's one area that could be clarified in an FAQ. And all of these FAQs, by the way, need to be rooted in what's in the standards. Can't really stray too far from what's there. It's not intended to be an interpretation of the standard, as Kaiua mentioned. So there's a limit to how far things can be done, but certainly there's some areas that can be clarified through the FAQs as pointed out in the paper. So Imran, hopefully that's helpful in terms of your question there. With respect to the overlap between recommendations 9 and 5, the working group did see a bit of a difference between the two. Even though the wording is a bit similar, the recommendation 5 was a little more specific to matters related to transparency in the auditor's report, including materiality, scope and approach, and other types of matters. Recommendation 9 was much broader, just saying there may be some things that pop up as part of ongoing global developments and implementation experiences that may need to be considered by the board going forward. And so recommendation 9 was much broader and just saying, on top of everything, it's useful to continue engaging with stakeholders in monitoring global developments and experiences. So I think, Tom, that closes off this particular discussion. We can move to the next and last slide here, and that's bringing this all to a close. The working group believes its activities regarding the post-implementation review are now complete, and is asking the board to confirm that. The focus will now turn to supporting other working groups, having a look at updating these FAQs as mentioned, and the probably more discussions needed now on the direction with respect to this signing partner matter. But as I mentioned, that might be something that could be further discussed with national standard setters. So Tom, this is the last round here in terms of whether the board agrees that this post-implementation review is completed, and if there's any final comments on the way forward.
Hey, any final comments? Kai?
Tom, thanks, and Dan, thanks all for your response. First of all, I would like to clarify that I'm not against a revision of ISRE 2010. The question raised, however, is whether the other assurance reports should be aligned with the auditor's report, with which I disagree for the reasons I gave. And now back to the question relating to the word, to the way forward. I see three quick responses. First of all, updating the auditor's reporting FAQ with respect to CAM, other than for the issue of how to phrase conclusions to they do not represent opinions. Secondly, creating non-authoritative guidance on when individuals other than the engagement partner signs an auditor's report. And last and thirdly, seeking to revise the review standards and the other assurance standards to align these with the auditor reports. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, I'm taking it that means that the board in general concurs that the PIR is complete, subject to all the comments and inputs that's been presented and the agreed actions within each recommendation, that we have a plan forward, but we're at the point of completion. I don't know right now whether it's a good time to call on Jim Dalkin if he has any observations, having heard the CAG discussion on this last week.
Thanks, Tom. Only two things that come to my mind. One is the CAG thought it appreciated the fact that there was this review of the reporting standard and follow-up. And then secondly, they were supportive of, rather than one large project, the ability to have the incremental updates on specific recommendations.
Thank you. I clearly will have to inform people of where we've landed on this, I think, as an outcome. Any other comments as a response to that? I want to ask Karen from a PIOB perspective, if you think we've been responsive to what we've heard from a public interest perspective.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I found the discussion very thorough in terms of the presentation of the feedback that the work for the PIR received. And I understand the messages that each of you have given in terms of the importance of work going forward. The only thing left is to see the prioritization. So it will be interesting to see the work plan when it comes forward on how to accomplish all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan, any concluding remarks that you'd like to make?
Nothing other than thanking the board for all of the input and the support, and of course, again, to thank the working group and staff for all of the hard work that's gone into this post-implementation review process. And as I mentioned earlier, the baton has now been passed to 3 other working groups and back to the board as part of the discussions of the future work plan. So thanks to all, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you. I think we'll conclude that session right now and close the public portion of the meeting today.